Good afternoon, everyone. We are here back with our Kapastik Notice Special Edition. We have two very interesting people from Northeast. Teresa Rahman, we know of her quite often. I do not have to introduce Teresa Baidu for sure. Aruna, being a very young journalist, has also made a very good niche for himself. So we are really grateful in Seher for having both of us, both of them in the session here. So over to you. The stage is yours, Teresa Baidu and Aruna.
Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Teresa Baidu, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
So it's quite a pity that we have to do this virtually in spite of living in the same city. But well, this is probably the new norm. Yeah, so I hope this, I hope we can add some value to your Saturday afternoon. I'm sure Teresa Baidu certainly can, and I'll try and be a decent host and get her to say a lot of things. So, Teresa Baidu, I think we will we'll keep this largely about your journalism and your work. Hello, am I audible?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. So, so let's begin with you've been a journalist for really, really long now, and journalism fundamentally, what journalism stands for, had changed over these years. We'll speak in detail about your journey, about your journalism a little later on. But since there's so much talk about journalism right now, right? Everyone's everyone's talking about journalism in light of coverage of certain things in the recent past. So, what do you think has fundamentally changed across mediums, not just TV? Has, if anything, has fundamentally changed, and if yes, what do you think has fundamentally changed? Since say the 90s.
If I talk about the Northeast, I think we have had our own prolific local media. We always had that, and with the coming of the regional TV channels, I think we started having a new. It's almost like a revolution in terms of news. But then, most of these TV channels were aired from Guwahati, and we still don't know what's happening in Mizoram. We still don't know what's happening in Tripura when we watch the TV channels, and we still don't know what's happening in the remote villages in say Nagaland. But I think with the coming of the new media, which is like these web portals, it's something which I discussed with you yesterday also, that we started having. Now we are having there's a joke that like in the 90s we had the PCOs in almost every lane of Guwahati. Now we seem to have a web portal here.
Right. Yeah.
And
right.
And not only web portals, YouTube channels. This visual media is so powerful now, and I think that this whole trend of getting hyper local news, people are starting to tell their stories. I think that's a very important development in terms of news. And now I feel that the 9 o'clock news that is being aired from the big cities, the mega metropolis like Delhi or Mumbai, is no longer sacred for us. We for many of us, it's like the news, what's happening in some village in Lakhimpur, some farmer doing something in some remote village in Nagaland, or these kind of stories are now catching our eyes and catching our attention, and these hyper local news. So sometimes when you feel that journalism is dead, journalism is gone, those normal complaints that people are having. But I feel that there's a counter revolution that's happening. People are these kind of the internet has revolutionized a lot of things, And on the ground, we can see a lot of changes, lot of voices airing their views, and lot of this hyperlocal news is something which, and when it comes to identity and ethnic, especially asserting your identity and ethnicity, there too you find news portals in different dialects, different languages, and they are being with translations, so these are things. I think there's a kind of a silent revolution going on, especially in I see this in the Northeast. And when it comes to news portals, I would also like to talk about my own venture, which I started almost 7 years back. It's called the Thumbprint magazine.
Right.
And that was some people often ask me, why did you start the Thumbprint? I often tell them that I used to work for Tehelka, and when I quit Tehelka, I thought that I would write for various national and international media organizations and write about the people of the Northeast, write about the men, women, and children of the Northeast. And that was the time when I realized that I had to struggle to find space for my stories, and stories which were of global standards. It's not that there was some problem with the quality of the story, but just that we are out of the radar of the so-called national media. So when I had to struggle to find space for my stories as an independent journalist, I was very angry. And this Thumbprint is a very, very angry reaction. I refused to beg for space. I said, I'm not going to beg for space. I'm going to create my own space. And that was where I discovered the might of the internet. And I live in a small town in Assam. I don't live in Guwahati. I keep coming, but I live in a small town in Assam. And I've been running this magazine from my living room in a small town in Assam, and we proudly call ourselves an international magazine with a Northeastern soul. So this, and I think that has given me the energy to move on, and because otherwise there was nothing, there was no space. So this is something which, and people often ask me, why did you call yourselves the Thumbprint? I said, it is because we are too tiny. I mean, we are on a shoestring budget. We are too tiny to leave a dent, but at least we can leave an imprint. And it would be too ambitious to call ourselves a bridge, but at best a scaffold. We are trying to reach out to the world and bring the world to our doorsteps. And I was surprised that nobody's ever refused to nobody's ever refused to write for us. It's amazing that we've got a lot of love, affection, and I realized that there was this people were looking for a space. People were looking for a credible space to reach out to the people of the Northeast, who were often missing from the discourse, missing from the so-called national media's agenda. So, and I think, and after that, that was 7 years back, and now we see there are so many web portals, and we might have differences about the quality of the news coverage, but yes, we are getting the voices, and as long as we are listening to the different voices, and we are getting there, and they are getting their voices heard, I think it's a very, very, very interesting development that I see in the Northeast now.
Right, that's very interesting. That's something that, as you began, there's actually there's this joke doing the rounds, right? Which you said that news portals in Assam are akin to PCOs in the 90s. Almost every lane in every small town in Assam would have some other news portal. So you spoke about quality. I mean, there are a lot of people. A lot of people have expressed a skepticism about them. Unlike say Thumbprint or Any Zine, which both of which are run by extremely experienced journalists. Include by you and Shashantada. A lot of these news websites, which people say that they don't have the checks and balances of a traditional newsroom. You put something out. When a journalist puts information out as opposed to a blogger putting some information out, a journalist is putting his professional integrity at stake, right? There's some kind of due diligence, some kind of editorial check. So do you believe that that this kind of quality issues will get ironed out as they evolve over time? How do you think we can strike a balance between making sure that people from people's voice are heard, because when you talk about the periphery, there are many peripheries within peripheries, right? For example, if a newsroom in Delhi is not interested in a voice from Northeast or a story from Northeast, a newsroom in Guwahati is probably not interested in a story from a Chor, right? So there are a lot of peripheries within peripheries. So it's, as you said, it's very important that people tell their own stories and the stories come out, and the internet has made sure, that people are being able to tell those stories. But there is certain concern that this could be a double-edged sword. This could be a nebulous development in certain ways. Do you think those concerns are, that there's some kind of legitimacy to those concerns, or do you think those are very minor concerns, compared to the kind of information that we have out there because of these news portals?
See, when I was in my journalism school, one of our teachers told us that don't think that your readers are fools. Okay, so this quality is something. The fact that the credibility of a journalist is something which, or credibility of a news portal is something which will stand the test of time. It's like if you are really frivolous, and if you're really and when you're comparing it with the big media channels, the kind of fake news they are propagating. So those are things which you'll have to think about. The credibility of certain big media houses are also at stake now. So I think that it's a development. We should let it flourish, and the quality will always sustain. Quality will survive, and I don't think that this anything which stands the test of time will have to have that quality. Have to have. Yeah, am I audible? Is it okay?
Yeah, you're good.
Yeah. So I think as of now, these are my minor concerns. I mean, I think just let them flourish. And I'm also interested. I find this kind of vlogging that's being done, vlogging by women in different villages from different small towns. I met this young YouTuber. She calls herself a booktuber. She reviews books in Assamese, in Oromia. So she's a young student. So I found her very interesting. I mean, she reads the books and she tries to review the book through her vlog, video, YouTube channel. So this kind of similar, YouTube channels have come up where even homemakers are talking about their concerns, talking about their lives. So I think these are useful documents. These are things which will, how is life in a Assamese village now? A young homemaker is talking how I make this pitha, how I make this. So these are maybe as a journalist I would have done a feature story on it. See, look at this. I'm weaving, and how am I innovating with different food, whatever. So these are things as a feature writer I would be interested in writing about. So I think, and that and I think when I think about that lady who's doing that vlog, I think that, you know, she's got a space, and we should not, you know, dismiss her as something frivolous or something. I think, you know, it's just important that she airs her views as well. So I think internet has opened up so many possibilities, and people are, you know, using it to express their views, and using it to and some of the YouTube channels, these YouTubers are so popular. uh, it's very interesting to see why they are popular. You know, maybe this guy, he speaks in a dialect which people
Absolutely.
like, you know, so this is something.
A lot of
And
these YouTube channels almost provide ethnographic insights, I suppose.
yes, yes.
I mean, I remember stumbling upon a YouTube video by a homemaker in Upper Assam, you know,
Mm,
and it's fascinating to see her, you know, just talk about her life, you know, and, you know, in the middle of a lockdown, and how people in the village were coping. So
mm,
I think that's the kind of journalism we'll never get to see, really, you know, from anywhere.
yeah.
So
Mm,
it's as you said, it's really fascinating. It's almost ethnographic, you know, like the
yes.
kind of insights that they provide. So
Mm,
yeah, thank you so much. That is that you know, that really opened up my mind to a certain extent. But going back to your journalism, you know, I'll let you speak about your journey, but you know, one story of yours that I have been particularly very fascinated by is, you know, when you broke that probably one of the biggest stories in the Northeast in the last 2 decades of, you know, of the so-called fake encounter. So as you know, I'm hoping a lot of young journalists are going to watch this, and you know, are watching this and are going to watch it since it's going to put up on YouTube. So what would you recommend young journalists? You know, how do you how do you get stories like that?
see, if you know, I've written this book called Bulletproof. You know,
Yes.
so this is basically my personal journey as a journalist, and this is where, in this book, I write a chapter on reporting a fake encounter, and you know, that was one story. Of course, it was a path-breaking story, and it led to a civil uprising, and it led to a lot of other repercussions also. And for many people told me that this is one story which, you know, plummeted me to a different league altogether. And you know, this is one. And I remember I was being interviewed by even a radio station in Toronto, and it was carried by almost all the leading newspapers all over the world. Um, but you know, in my book, I try to introspect and think about that story that I did, and the aftermath of the story, and the life of a journalist who reports on such, you know, stories from underreported regions like the northeast of India, where you don't have a support system. There is no, when I talk about a support system, I also talk about physical support system. I talk about a network. I talk about legal support system, because after that, I had to face, I was grilled by the CBI, the SIT, the Judicial
I read
Commission,
about it. Yeah.
and so it was, and that was a time when I was expecting my second baby. So, you know, it was a very, for me, it was a very traumatic experience. And I was already a mother. So, you know, this whole killing and how it led to that uprising, somehow it changed my life. And as a journalist, I felt that, you know, that was the time when I realized that um, it can be a very lonely journey when you have to face the authorities, when you are questioned, and you don't know, reporting conflict can lead to surprises in it
Right.
can spring surprises in every step, and you don't know where you'll end up. And there may be incidents which might not have any precedence in the past, and probably it will never happen to anyone in the future. But you know, that story left an imprint, and it also changed my life in many ways. But it also led to also had to seek professional help for post-traumatic stress disorder.
I did read about
Because,
it in my book.
yeah,
Yes.
because I was also expecting my second child. So through that story, by narrating my experience in my book, I'm also trying to talk about the psychological trauma of a journalist, uh, the vulnerabilities of a journalist reporting from a conflict zone, and how important it is to have a support system, a network. Um, and maybe probably somebody might learn from my experience that, and so I also remember talking to my journalist colleague in Arunachal Pradesh, Tongam Rina. She's the associate editor of Arunachal Times. She was shot at while she was entering her office. That was some time back. And after that, she had to undergo a lot of psychological trauma, and she had, in fact, for post-traumatic stress disorder, she spent a year in Germany. There was this institute, I forgot the name. So she told me once, I had interviewed her, and she said that, isn't it strange that I had to go to Germany to find, some kind of support for a year, why can't we have that in India? And after reading my book, she said, I want to hug you, so that is something which, only when you have gone through it, you can understand how traumatic it can be. And I'm glad I did that story. It's not that, but just that, it changed my life, and it made me think about, and people often ask me, why did you call your book Bulletproof? So there's an interesting story behind that too. Like, I was at a conference of women journalists.
I think you write it about in the prologue to the book, I think.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
somebody asked me, do you wear a bulletproof jacket when you go reporting? So that was the time when I realized that, okay, journalists also wear bulletproof jackets. I didn't know about that. So I studied in the Indian Institute of Mass Communication, but my journalism school never taught me how to take care of myself, how to take care of my physical and psychological health, as well as my gadgets. Now, you have to even think about the safety of your gadgets, digital safety, the surveillance. So these are things which our journalism schools don't teach. So these are things we learned through, by facing it on the job, So it was the story was, I don't know. I mean, I'm glad I did that story, but I think it also takes a lot of courage to talk about your vulnerabilities. And I'm glad I wrote this book and spoke about what I faced.
I'm very grateful that you speak about it so honestly. This whole thing about a story versus the risks associated with it, right? And you speak about it. You've written about it in your book also, in Bulletproof also, and that's something that a lot of journalists, a lot of conversations in newsroom around the subject are happening right now because of the prevailing circumstances. For instance, when the pandemic first struck in the country, right? Because every newsroom, wanted to get stories, wanted to have reporters on the ground, but there are obviously real risks associated with it. So, as a journalist, as an editor, what do you think is the line? And it's probably a very subjective line in the first place, but how do you draw that line? When is it worth it? Because they say that no story is worth your life. So first of all, do you think that's correct? Is a story worth your life? And but in any case, where do you draw that line, between the risks associated and the public interest behind that story?
When I went reporting, I just went with my pen, notebook, and my intuition. So for me, every story was worth it. For me, I was so passionate about my work. I never thought about my personal safety and what I might encounter. And
That's
for
why I
me,
asked as editor now, since you're an editor and I mean, as probably like a young reporter, if you were to guide a young reporter, where do you draw that line? When is it worth it and when is it not? I mean, there's no point, even if it's a story of great public interest, but where is that line?
See, if the story is of great public interest, I think it's worth to take the risk. But we have to, if we can, think about the pros and cons. If we can build a net, at least a safety net, or some kind of a network, some kind of a backup, that if you land in legal trouble, we have this team of lawyers to support you. If you end up in, like I got to know much later that many international foreign media houses, they have specialized training when their reporters go to hostile areas. It's called the HIFAT, Hostile Environment and First Aid Training. So maybe we can have, these are things which are very new to the Indian media ecosystem. I don't think any media house provides these kind of trainings, even when the reporters go for any kind of stories on disaster. But for me, if I can smell a story, I'll go for it. And there are risks in every profession, but as a journalist, I will never miss a story. I cannot afford to miss a story. Maybe if I won't send the young reporter, I'll go myself. But then, yeah, it's always worthwhile to have a support system. It's like a double-edged sword. I cannot afford to miss a story, which I know is worth it. But risking your life, well, you can risk your life everywhere. You go out on the street, you risk your life. You might be hit by a car. So as a journalist, believe me, I can't miss a story. I mean, somehow it's not worth missing a story, and nothing is worth missing a story. But yes, we need to have a support system. We need to create an ecosystem where, we can talk to each other. We can support journalists who need help, who need legal support, or maybe medical support, or some kind of insurance. These are things we don't talk about in the newsroom. In fact, in many newsrooms in Assam, we don't even have a separate toilet for women, or a maternity provision for maternity leave for women. Forget about these kind of support systems or legal support systems. So I remember recently, I think there was a news about this lady who had to quit because she was expecting. Because she was expecting.
Yes.
So there's so many things which this is something which I strongly feel that we journalists, we write about others, but we don't write about our own concerns. We don't write that there is no separate toilet for the lady there, or she's not getting her maternity leave, or we're just going out to the field, on the field, and without any kind of support, without any kind of backup. But then a story is a story for me. It's like I will not miss a story for anything.
I suppose, I mean, speaking from my personal experience, I think it probably gets even lonelier when you are, say, stationed as a correspondent, a Northeast correspondent of a national newsroom. I mean, then you don't even have the, support of a physical newsroom as such, right? So I think, I'm sure you also, when you were at Tehelka, this must have been the same to a certain extent for you, because you're pretty much by yourself there, right? I mean, it's, yeah, all that you have is a phone call, that's all you can make. But then, in terms of, support of people in a physical newsroom, you just don't have it, So I suppose that makes things even more complicated.
Yeah, so, I still remember, when the SIT team came from Manipur.
Right.
They called me and they said, tell us where can we meet you in Guwahati? And I used to work from home. My laptop was my office. So I couldn't invite them home, nor could I meet them in the cafe or something, these are like SIT. So, then I told them that I'll meet you in the local police station. So, they were also a little thinking that what is this woman up to, but I said, I felt that the safest place for me was the local police station. So I met them at the local police station. So I don't know, I just learned, I tried to,
How to maneuver.
yeah, maneuver and how to, and I also realized that I was stepping into an old boys club. It was conflict reporting or something very, very masculine, and there were colleagues who never share ideas or stories, or it's like I have to, I had my own set of sources who would, give me information, and the sources could also include the constable of the local thana, or maybe the nurse at the Guwahati Medical College, or that delivery boy, the Swiggy's delivery boy. So these kind of I had a strong network all over, and I did not expect any kind of help from my male colleagues in the sense of my contemporaries, because they would. It was all the more lonely for me because I was a female journalist reporting conflict.
Sure,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah. So that is something which I do feel that, I strongly felt that I was a lone wolf, treading an untrodden path.
Right. Something else that I also want to speak about is the virtue of patience, which is increasingly becoming a rare commodity in Indian journalism. For example, the virtue of patience, waiting for stories, because as investigative journalists, there'll be days when you get nothing. There'll be a lot of dead ends. For example, when you in your chapter on meeting Muiba, you talk about being stationed in Saramati, which is all of us as reporters have done, waiting for that call, from Hebron to go, that's increasingly become a rare commodity. You can't just blame reporters, but also because, editors want a quick turnaround of stories, and such news cycle has become such. So, if you could talk about, how being patient has helped you as a journalist, and the kind of support, if how were your editors, because obviously, journalism is teamwork, right? And it's not just enough for you to be patient. It's essential that your editors are also willing to spend time and money that's required for good journalism. So if you could, talk about that a little, your experiences of, having to wait for stories for days on end, waiting for that call to come and getting that big lead, and what you do in the meantime, in that waiting time to productively use that time, so yeah, stuff like that.
Yeah. In fact, actually, I'm lucky in that sense that I was not into a 24/7 TV channel. I was working for a weekly magazine. And that was the time when Tehelka was at its peak, and that was the time when some of the finest editors were there at the helm of affairs, like Sankarshan Thakur, Harinder Baweja, so these were people who, they were like, Sankarshan Thakur is like, I always call him a gentleman editor, he's one of the finest editors I've worked with. So, and I was patient in the sense that I would wait for the right time to strike, but I was also very, very impatient. I had to get my story. So I would, if it's not coming this way, I'll go this way. It's like, koi bhi, just rush.
If I journalist,
So,
knock on all doors. Somebody will open.
So I won't call myself a very patient journalist. Yeah. If I had to get my story, I'll get my story by hook or crook, either way, So it's like, and then I was fortunate that I had some fine editors who were there to, But then, I was back here. I was all alone, I was all alone, and when I remember going to meet Muiba, there was a crossfire, and I just called up my editor in Delhi, and I said, "There's a firing going on." He's like, "Oh my God, stay safe, so that's all they could say.
Yeah,
And
that's all they say. Yeah.
yeah. And that was the time I realized later I thought, I never wore a bulletproof jacket or anything. So I just went and
Yeah, it almost always sinks in later, right? I mean,
yeah,
when you're doing it, when you're posting a story,
yeah,
you're not really scared. When it
yeah,
sinks in much later, when you're back to your hotel room, and
yeah.
okay, that could have gone, that could have gone either way.
Yeah. So
Uh,
I'm a typical journalist. I am, if I have to get a story, I'm not patient. I mean, maybe I'm patient till the time I can strike, but yes, I'm very impatient. I get my story.
Right. There's something I happened to meet Bertil Linkner a couple of years back in Guwahati, and a bunch of young journalists, and it was an informal conversation. And he said something which really stayed with me. He said that don't make sources, make friends. And so what I wanted to ask you was, uh, how do you cultivate a source? I mean, because you're not a daily reporter, right? You're not a newspaper reporter that used to cover the municipality, and okay, this must be a meeting, and you will talk to this guy who will say what happened. But you had to track the whole of Northeast, and sources could be, as you said, could come in all shapes and sizes, and you have to keep that relationship going, right? And across states. So, and most of the time it could just be like a courtesy call, like it's just making sure that you are in touch with that person. So how did you manage that? How did you strike the balance between, between, as you said, being an impatient reporter, always knocking on all doors for that story, but also making sure that the dormant sources you're also in touch with them, and if something comes up, you will, you will get the story, or you will get the lead. How did you ensure that happened?
Well, I think just as you are managing, I mean, I may be impatient, but I'm not irritating. I won't. So I know where to stop, where to draw the line, and
Right.
there are certain stories which I'll get from the top cop there, and there are which you'll get from the person who is guarding the, maybe the gatekeeper. So it's like just keeping your eyes and ears open, and there are certain stories which are lying, just you just have to open your eyes. So this is something which I realized when I did a story about this. It's a sanitation story about my domestic help. I
Right.
was talking to her, and I asked her, what do you do when your village looks very clean, people don't defecate out in the open, but when it floods, when it's flooding, where your toilets are underwater, how do you defecate then? And that was the time when she came out with this horror story of how they build a boat out of a stem of a banana tree, and then it's like a raft, and they have to row the raft, and especially when it's night, and go and find a clean spot to defecate. And that was the time when she also told me that for me it's even more difficult because I'm a widow. I don't have a man to row the raft for me. I can't ask some other man to do that for me. So and then I started talking to women of her age, and other women who are there, and then came out this horror story of sanitation of flood. And that was a story which I did sitting in my living room, and and that story fetched me that international award, Wash Media Award, which is given by the stock. And so that is where as a journalist, my eyes and ears are always open. um is my internet okay? I mean, hello?
Probably a little patchy. It's probably dropping a little, but I can hear
Dropping?
you though.
Okay. Okay. So that is where I feel that there is no rule for to get how to get your story. You just have to be a very
Your eyes and ears open, basically.
curious
Yeah.
and a clever journalist, and
Right.
not be very pushy.
Right.
People
Right.
will come to you with stories, so.
Right. 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 So, and I've always really admired Thumbprint. Was it a conscious decision to sort of veer away from the kind of reporting you're doing for Tehelka, which was essentially a lot about conflict and all the bad things about Northeast, that people almost start to identify about the Northeast, whereas a lot of stories are ignored. A lot of not legitimate, perfectly legitimate stories which should have made to the papers and other websites and magazines, had they been some other part of the country, are ignored. So what is the conscious decision to kind of veer away, sort of veer away from that hard boiled idea of conflict reportage and say give more space to like say stories like you just referred to? Or was that a conscious call?
Yeah, of course it was. And in fact, our first cover story was an interview with Jerry Pinto, the writer.
Right. Yeah.
And our headline was, "Write Your Stories, Jerry Pinto Tells Northeast India." So the launch edition of the Thumbprint, we had this, "Write Your Stories, Jerry Pinto Tells Northeast India." So basically, everyone was like, okay, another website from Northeast India, they're going to talk about the Naga peace talks, they're going to talk about this, the territorial integrity of Manipur, and this. I said, no, write your stories. So this is something which I've been repeatedly saying, that your story is what you have. Just tell your stories. And in fact, as a journalist reporting from the region, I was tired of the narrative flowing out of the region, the control narrative, same kind of stories. And so the same kind of statistics, the same kind of the press releases, the dry press releases, which has the number of arms and ammunition recovered, the so many kills, so many, and the same. And so I thought that it's very important that we write up the other stories. Like, for instance, the Brahmaputra. Like, we grew up by the banks of the Brahmaputra. I grew up in Guwahati, but we never really appreciated that river. How much do we know about Brahmaputra? So I started writing, and then there is this. I did this story about this boatman who ferries people across the Jia Bhoroli River. It's a tributary of the Brahmaputra, and his life, he said that my life is so hectic that I can't attend weddings or funerals. It's like, if I'm not there, people will not be able to cross. So he and then the last time I met him, he was like, he was wearing a mask, and he said, oh, I try to maintain social distancing on my boat as well. And, those kind of, so how he, he said that, I don't want my children to become boatmen. I want them to study and go to school and college. So, and then I spoke to one boat maker. He said, it's a very tough job to make a boat, a country boat. So their life, their stories, these are missing, and so the Brahmaputra has so much to offer, so many stories by the banks of the river, the cultural, the ethnographic stories, and everything, even Guwahati. Like, we did once for the Thumbprint, we had a series called Giant Guwahatians. So that was something when I said that, Guwahati as a city has never been celebrated. We talk about Delhi ki laddu, Delhi meri jaan, and there's so many books on Delhi. Then Mumbai meri jaan. That Calcutta is a city of joy. But for Guwahati and Guwahatians, the people who have lent warmth and character to the city, we never celebrated their lives. So we started a series called Giant Guwahatians. Then we had a series called Maneuvering Majuli. So the different stories about Majuli. I still remember this. I met this college lecturer in Majuli who said that in Majuli, it's interesting if you know that almost every family they have two homes, one in Majuli and one either in Titapur or Jorhat, because they fear that their house might be drowned someday in the floods. So they have two homes. And this gentleman who taught in a college, he said that he had an unmarried daughter who was physically, who had some kind of physical disability. Can you hear me? Dropping? Okay. I can't hear you, but
It's fine. I was muted. It's fine. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So that was, there's so many interesting things about Majuli. So we had this series called Maneuvering Majuli, and then the different we talk about celebrating Eid. We asked people from different communities about how they celebrated Eid, and the kind of how did they celebrate Ramzan. So these kind of stories which are missing from the daily discourse, the so-called mainstream papers, media. So we try to bring it through the thumbprint. So yeah, so that's how
Right.
we're trying to be
Right.
different.
You spoke about, a conflict reportage or the journalism at that point being a boys' club, right? Probably. So when you were growing up and you wanted to be a journalist, did you have journalism heroes, or people you wanted to be like? Because I mean, obviously, the kind of reporting you did as a female journalist, I hate using that term because no one uses the term male journalist, but so did you have role models to look up to at that point? How did it all happen? Wanting to go to IMC, being a journalist, I mean, how did it all happen?
See, I'm the only black sheep of the family. Like there are no journalists in the family, and there was no one. I didn't have any mentors, but I don't know. I started writing for those children's pages when I was a kid as a cub reporter. I used to write, and I used to be fascinated by seeing my name in print. And my mother had a huge collection of magazines, the Illustrated Weekly, Reader's Digest, Femina, Eve's Weekly. She used to collect those magazines. And I used to read them. I used to sit there and read. And I used to imagine myself in those bylines. I wanted my name. I wanted to see my name in those bylines. So there was nobody to tell me who a journalist is, what does a journalist do, or there was nobody to tell me that you should be a journalist. It's just that I wanted to be a journalist because I wanted to write, I wanted to see my name in print, and I wanted to maybe to be known. And so my father initially, he didn't quite like the idea because he felt that it's a useless profession. But then later when I insisted that I was determined that I would be a journalist. I don't know. So that's why I say, I'm the only black sheep in the family. And now, later, my parents were proud of me that, okay, she's doing something worthwhile, something meaningful, because they had no idea. So, there was no mentor. And then the fact that I studied in Delhi, and then I worked as a trainee journalist I started off as a trainee journalist with India Today magazine. And, there was a joke then that, there are two kind of journalists in India, people who work for India Today and people who don't work for India Today. So that was the time, there were some of the finest editors there. I was a trainee, and it was very boring to work on the desk of a weekly magazine. Because
I did exactly the same. I was a training desk here in India Today. And at those long nights, those long production nights on Wednesday night.
Long production night.
Yeah.
And other days are so boring. And so, but I had worked with our copy editor was Mr. Joel Rai. He was one of the finest, copy editors one could afford to have. And so he realized that this girl is not meant for the desk. He said, you should go for reporting. You are not for the desk. And so, and that was, and later I came back to Guwahati and joined the Telegraph, and then I started writing, became a correspondent.
Right. Right. So while when you started out and when you did your journalism, I mean, the first couple of years, I mean, it was in a lot of ways, the golden decade of Indian journalism, right? Things were opening up. There were magazines, there was money in the profession. Now there is a lot of gloom and doom, right? I come across, Facebook posts, former colleagues and, friends. Everyone someone or the seems to be losing a job every single day. And there's in general a lot of negativity, like there's a friend of mine I remember who wrote a long post saying, somebody called her up saying, a young aspiring journalist, in a journalism school, what should I do, and say that, yeah, don't be a journalist, just don't be a journalist. So what would you say to that, because people, whereas as we spoke, there's a lot of content coming out, right, of different kinds in different mediums, but there is this popular perception that journalism in the conventional form, the kind of journalism that you did, when you started off, is dying, and that's extremely extremely morose thought to think of it, as professional journalist. But do you think that's true? Would you, for example, if your kids came up to you tomorrow and said, "I want to be a journalist," would you be encouraging?
It is indeed very depressing when I see the scene now. And I know I won't be able to work in any of these newsrooms, especially television newsrooms. When I think of it, I just asked some of my friends who are still working, I said, "Kaise kar lete ho? No, kaise, how can you produce this kind of news?" He said, "I don't even watch it. I just go home and I watch those cookery channels. I watch those, recipes, and I just don't watch this. I just do it as a job because I have to work." Uh, but yes, but I still refuse to be, refuse to say no, dismiss everything. As I said in the initially, when how this new kind of voices are coming up, people are writing, people are doing vlogging, people are experimenting with new media, which like I didn't have a smartphone, I didn't have a mobile phone for many years as a journalist, like my editor used to say, "You can afford one, why don't you buy one?" I said, "I don't want to be tracked by you." So, but now you can't do without a mobile phone. So I think times are changing, and this is just a passing phase. I will never say that journalism will die. I'm a diehard optimist. I think the good old shoe leather journalism will come back, and good things will always come back. I'm
Sure,
just
there's a lot of good journalism still happening, amidst
still
all
happening.
the
Yeah,
gloom. There's a lot of
yeah.
still good journalism coming out of India, to be honest. Yeah.
Yeah. And then this media schools, I mean, I also despair at what the kind of things that they are teaching. It's much um, more of advertising, more of propaganda. It's like more of glitz and glamour. But I have spoken to some very young students of media who are serious about what they want to do. So I'm still hopeful, and I feel that a lot need to be done for media research. I used to do a lot of media analysis for the Hoot, and it was so interesting how, once I wrote about how when Aurobindo Rajkhwa, the Alpha chairman, he came back and he was going home to
Right.
meet his mother, and the whole TV crew followed him, and with Bhupen Hazarika songs, playing, Moya Hisu, Moya Hisu, those kind of songs, and he's sitting with his mother. They barge into the bedroom, and they zoom on him. So I wrote about those phenomena. So I think with the closing down of the Hoot, one very interesting space has closed down, where you analyze how media is evolving, how media is developing. And so I think media students should also concentrate on media research, should try to understand what's happening, the changes that are happening. But there are people who would still love to read the newspaper, people who, as I said, don't think that your readers are fools. So there is always this hunger for news, for good news, good journalism, and good reportage. And I don't think everything would die down just like that. It's just a passing phase. I'm just hopeful.
Right.
Yes.
I think on that
yeah,
optimistic note, I think we've done around an hour. I think we could take some questions if there are
yeah,
any.
yeah, if you have any questions.
Hi, Aruna.
Hi.
Yeah, so there are no questions on the panel right now. So you can continue with the session.
Fine. We'll just
Yeah.
continue for a bit. Am I audible?
Yes, Aruna, you're audible.
Yeah. Yeah. As in, since we're talking about journalism and since we were talking about media ventures and particularly Teresa Baijo's own Thumbprint magazine, there's a lot of talk about the subscription based model, and there has been some success, for example, the New York Times and New Yorker in the US particularly, their subscription revenues have started to exceed the advertising revenues. A lot of Indian media houses are starting to experiment with it. So, what do you think of the subscription model? Do you think that if quality journalism is to sustain and survive, it is inevitable that the subscription model has to take precedence?
Yeah, definitely. You cannot survive without money. And uh, for us, for me, I mean, I started the venture, but I know very well that I'm just a journalist. I don't have that marketing mind, but money is important. So if you can spend 15 rupees for a cold drink, or $100 for a cup of coffee, I mean, I'm sure you can spend some amount for some good quality news. So I think there'll be takers for good quality news and journalism. And well, yes, if instead of corporates funding you, if you can go by the subscription method, why not?
Right. And before we wrap up, I'd strongly advise everyone to get a copy of Teresa Baijo's books. I have one of them. I'm yet to read her first book actually, which is a shame. We have heard a lot of good things about it. Teresa Baijo, would you recommend what other books from the Northeast, would you recommend? I mean, let's keep it contemporary. Let's not go back to let's not talk about Gate and stuff. Let's talk about contemporary books in the last 10-15 years that by not just authors from Northeast, but books from the Northeast, that you think have provided a fresh perspective and have given new insights that you particularly been impressed by.
See, Sonja Hazarika's books, of course, they give a
Yeah.
They just introduce you to the Northeast.
They're a good primer to if you want to understand the Northeast, you should begin with Strangers in the Mist. I think it's the simplest, well-narrated account of the last 50 odd years. Yeah.
So recently I had read a book called Insider Outsider, which is edited
anthology of stories by Samrat.
And Preeti Gill.
Yeah.
So that is something which it's not it's just non-fiction, it's just narratives by people, and that gives a very fresh perspective, talking about the whole insider outsider thing about who's an insider in the Northeast or who's an outsider. So that I think is a very interesting book, and it was a breakaway from the conventional books that we have about the usual stuff about distances and conflicts. We never get to hear the other side of the story. So who's the outsider? Who are you branding as the outsider? So I think these fresh voices that are coming up. I would be very interested to know about, hear about these stories, and I would also be interested to know about, say, for instance, the Muslims of the Northeast. So that there's so many off late I've realized that I'm also a Muslim. So that this whole identity about just one of the layers of my identity is that I'm also a Muslim, and where do I stand? What is my contribution? So and Muslim women, we are so different from say a Muslim woman in Bihar or UP. So the whole thing is. So I think there's so many narratives floating around now, and I feel that we need more. We'll get more books, more nonfiction. I'm interested only in nonfiction. So I would like to hear more stories about not just the blood and gore, but the other things which
the more layers underneath that.
more layers underneath. Yes.
Right. I think it was excellent for me personally. It was an extremely enriching conversation, as it always is, to talk when I speak to Teresa Vaidyo. So I think we could wrap it up right now. And thanks a lot to everyone for letting me do this, and particularly to Teresa Vaidyo for answering my questions. I'm very patient with some of my questions. I think thanks a lot.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Seher. And
thank you, Seher, particularly. Of course.
Yes.